Recently, President Joe Biden said semi-automatic weapons, not just automatic weapons, semi-automatic weapons should be banned. And he also said we should ban assault weapons. Apparently, President Biden believes semi-automatic weapons are also assault weapons.
The idea we still allow semi-automatic weapons to be purchased is sick. It's just sick. It has no social redeeming value. Zero. None. I'm going to try.
What will you try and do?
I'm going to try to get rid of assault weapons.
During the lame duck?
I'm going to do it whenever I got to make that assessment as I get in and start counting the votes.
Now, a Washington Post editorial recently said, the United States has averaged nearly 2 mass shootings a day this year, according to the Gun Violence Archive, which tracks when 4 or more people are shot. To put that another way, it is now unusual to have a day without a mass shooting. We aren't numb, we're traumatized, tweeted Shannon Watts, founder of Moms Demand Action, which has been urging action to stop gun violence in America since the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting that took the lives of 20 children and 6 staffers a decade ago. And former top Barack Obama aide David Axelrod recently tweeted the following, quote, research reflects what should be obvious. More guns mean more gun deaths and violence, not more safety and security. The U.S. leads the world in gun ownership and gun violence by far. Only Yemen, that's right, Yemen experiences more, end of quote. Axelrod was involved in a Twitter war. Other people jumped in to help Axelrod with my next guest. He is John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. John, thank you very much for taking the time.
It's great to talk to you again, Larry. Thanks for having me on.
John, I was following that whole Twitter exchange you had with Axelrod. At some point, Axelrod peeled off. I wonder why.
I don't know. He didn't last very long in the discussion. Pretty much.
He did not.
Look, he was relying on a guy named Adam Lankford from the University of Alabama, who, claimed that a third of the mass public shootings in the world were in the United States. And I had tried to get his list of cases for years. Media had tried to get his list of cases for years. He wouldn't give it out. I decided to go and actually put a list together. And we found literally thousands of cases around the rest of the world that he had missed. And, it just wasn't a serious discussion. He was able to find all the cases in the United States. I mean, people put those types of lists together. But he missed many cases in Europe. He missed many cases around the world. He wouldn't even say what languages he used. He just pointed to his source, at one time being the NY Police Department. But if you read the NY Police Department, they say they didn't even try to get most of the cases in the rest of the world. They just basically looked at some cases in English language sources, and that wasn't a very useful way to go about doing it. So, rather than the types of numbers he was claiming, what you find is that the United States makes up about 1% of the world's mass public shooters, even though we make up about 4.5% of the world's population. So we're way below the world average. And the other thing he didn't put it in terms of per capita terms. The United States has over 330 million people. You can't compare the United States to, let's say, Norway with 5 million, or Finland with 5 million, or Switzerland with 8 million or something. You have to put things in per capita terms. It makes no more sense than comparing California, the total number of murders in California, with the total number of murders in Wyoming or Rhode Island. Any newspaper would put it in terms of per capita terms, but somehow when you're looking at mass public shootings, they don't think that logic applies there. And when you do, what you find is that there are a number of countries in Western Europe that have a higher per capita rate of either attacks or deaths from mass public shootings than the United States does. And, there's so many things. You're bringing up the Washington Post, and they're relying on the Gun Violence Archive. The Gun Violence Archive looks at 3 or more people killed. But the problem is almost all their cases, almost 90% of their cases, involve fights between drug gangs. Now, are fights between drug gangs important? Are there things that we should be concerned about? Yeah. But what happens is that people go and mention the types of school shootings or shootings at a mall or whatever, where the point of the attack is to simply go and kill as many people as possible. And there's a reason why the FBI, when it's put its numbers together, has had a definition of active shooting cases where a gun is fired in public, not part of some other type of crime like a robbery or a gang fight over drug turf. It could be anything from one person being shot at and missed to a mass public shooting. If you take their definition of mass public shootings, it would be 4 or more people killed with the rest of that definition. And that's just a fraction of the tiny fraction of the gun violence cases that they put out. And they have many errors in even what they do, even with their own definition.
John, one of the people that joined in the discussion, I don't believe it was Axelrod, challenged you and said something to the effect of, if we had a ban on guns, watch gun violence go down. And you responded.
Right. Well, look, there are places in the world that have tried it. We don't need to guess. We've had places in the United States that have had bans on handguns, like Chicago and Washington, D.C. Gun control advocates will say, well, those really weren't fair tests. Murder rates went up afterwards. But in order for it to work, you need to go and ban guns every place in the country, because otherwise people can go to Maryland or Virginia or the rest of Illinois or Indiana to be able to go and get guns. That doesn't explain why it went up. It may explain why it didn't fall the way they were promising, because people were making the same promises before those laws were passed that this person on Twitter was making. But the point is, you can look around the world, even island nations, which would supposedly be the ideal experiment. Every single time that either all guns or all handguns have been banned, every single time murders have gone up. And they've gone up often by very large amounts. And there's a simple reason for that, and that is, and this applies to gun control laws generally, not just gun bans, but you have to worry that when you pass a law that's not primarily going to disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals. And when you pass a ban, who do you think's the people who are most likely to turn in their guns? It's the most law-abiding citizens. And if you disarm the most law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, guess what? You're going to make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes. You know, you can look at a country like Mexico. Mexico, since 1972, has only one gun store in the country. The most powerful gun that you can buy in Mexico is a .22 caliber short round rifle. Well, you know, that's not the type of gun that drug gangs are using down there. And yet Mexico, in many years, the murder rate went up more than double after they passed that very strict gun control law, hardly what was being promised to people. And not only did it double, but Mexico in many years now has a murder rate that's 6 or at least 5 times the murder rate in the United States. And so, you know, they have every gun control law you could possibly think of. Less than 1/10 of 1% of the adult population in Mexico is legally licensed to own a gun. It hasn't stopped the drug gangs from getting guns any more than Mexico's been able to stop them from getting the illegal drugs that they sell. They bring them in from around the world.
And John, that brings us to how often Americans use guns for defensive purposes, either because they fear that they'll be killed or they fear serious bodily injury. I watched a lot of reaction to what happened with the Colorado gay shooter, the Walmart shooting, and nobody talks about how often Americans use guns to defend themselves.
Right. But it's not just in general the rate that they do it, but it's also the rate that they stop these active shooting types of attacks. So, you know, Biden, in the clip that you just showed, said that there's absolutely no reason that people should own guns. There's no benefit from people owning guns. Well, look, police are extremely important, but police can't be there all the time. They virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And we put out a report earlier this year that showed that the FBI active shooting reports were missing lots of cases where civilians had stopped the attacks. They claimed over the 8 years from 2014 to 2021, there were only 11 instances where civilians legally carrying guns stopped what would have been an active shooting attack. Well, we found 124, 11 times more than what they had. And I make no claim that we found all the cases that were there, because we didn't have the millions of dollars to go and do the news search that the people that were hired by the FBI to go and do had to do it. But the bottom line is is that, and I'm most confident about the most recent years, if you look at 2021, for example, 49% of active shooting attacks were stopped by legally armed citizens. If you separate out places where they were banned from having guns, because when I worked in the Department of Justice, I tried in vain to say, look, guys, you have to differentiate between places where citizens are legally allowed to have a gun versus ones where they're not. Because if it's illegal for them to have a gun in certain places, and we're talking about law-abiding citizens stopping these attacks, you can't expect them to be carrying a gun and stopping an attack in those places. And if you focus on those cases that they stopped in places that they were able to legally carry a gun, in 2021, almost 60% of active shooting cases were stopped by legally armed citizens in places where they were allowed to have a gun. So, that's the most direct comparison to the issue that we're talking about here that you were just bringing up. But if you talk about crimes generally, you're talking about 5 times more frequently each year that people use guns to stop crimes than guns are used in the commission of crimes.
Finally, John, in the clip that we played, Biden said he wanted to ban not just assault weapons, not just automatic weapons, but semi-automatic weapons. Right. That's almost all of them.
Right. Look, about 85% of handguns are pure semi-automatic guns. It means one pull the trigger, one bullet comes out. It reloads itself. One pull the trigger, one bullet comes out. About a similar percentage of rifles. And if you include revolvers in there, which are effectively function very similar to semi-automatics, you're talking about basically about almost 100% of handguns. But look, what you have when you look at this is there's a simple reason why people benefit from having semi-automatics. So if he wants to ban all semi-automatic rifles, and you have, what's the alternative? You have to have a manually loaded, where you have to physically yourself, after you fire a shot, put another bullet in the chamber. And the problem is if you have to fire the gun more than once because you have multiple attackers, or you fire and miss, or you fire and wound but don't stop the attacker from coming after you, you may not have the luxury of time to manually reload your gun. It's a simple safety issue that's there. And the notion that somehow just because you go and you ban guns in the country, that criminals aren't going to be able to go and get a hold or have semi-automatic guns compared to these manually loaded guns that he wants civilians to be able to have is simply not serious. But he's going to be endangering a lot of people's lives by going and wanting to go and ban it. And here's the problem. He's kept on saying this. This isn't the first time he's talked about banning semi-automatic guns. He's said this many times. He said it earlier this year in New York. He said it last year at a town hall at CNN. He said it when he was campaigning in private meetings for the 2020 election. He said it over and over again. But what happens is the fact checkers come out and said, well, he didn't really mean it. He misspoke. Or he was talking about banning guns that could hold, were capable of holding 15 rounds. I don't know if these reporters that do these fact checkings, they have known nothing about guns. But any semi-automatic gun that can hold a magazine of 10 rounds can hold one of 15 rounds or 20 rounds or 30 rounds. And so for Biden to go and say is capable of holding, he essentially, again, is wanting to ban all semi-automatic guns. But the fact checkers will say, well, it doesn't ban this one particular model because the standard magazine that it comes with is 15 rounds. And in this particular comment, he said 20 rounds. Or, the standard round is 10 in this one. And he was talking about banning 15. It just doesn't make any sense. And the mental gymnastics that they're willing to go through, possibly because they have no knowledge of guns, is simply embarrassing.
John Lott, president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. The website is crimepreventionresearch.org. Make a substantial contribution. John, as always, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thank you for being there, Larry.
You got it. I'm Larry Elder. This has been the Larry Elder Show for Epoch Times. We got a country to save. See you next time.